A widowed farmer sees an elderly woman tied up without water for 3 days, until Reyes had lived alone for many years on his small farm at the edge of the village. Life had been quiet ever since his wife passed away. She had been his partner in everything, helping him with the crops, tending the animals, and filling the house with warmth. After her death, the house felt empty. The laughter and chatter were gone. Even the animals seemed to notice the sadness in him. He had grown used to his lonely routine, but sometimes the evenings were the hardest. Sitting outside on his small wooden chair, watching the sun sink behind the hills, he could almost hear her voice in the rustling of the trees. Every morning, Reyes woke before the sun. He would wash his face with the cold water from the well and then go out to the fields. The soil needed constant care. The wheat, the vegetables, and the few fruit trees he had all demanded attention. Even though he was tired from the work, he felt a quiet satisfaction seeing the plants grow under his care. Each seed he planted reminded him of hope, even if life itself had been hard. The village people respected him because of his honesty and hard work, though they knew very little about the pain he carried inside. One hot afternoon, Reyes decided to check the irrigation canal. The canal had not been cleaned for weeks, and the water sometimes stopped flowing when dirt and weeds blocked its path. He took a long wooden stick with him, walking carefully along the narrow path that ran beside the fields. The air was dry and smelled of dust and earth. Birds were singing in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind gave him a faint feeling of company. As he walked, he noticed something unusual. There was a shadow near an old, abandoned shed at the edge of the path. At first he thought it was a stray dog or a pile of old cloth, but as he got closer, he realized it was a person. He froze for a moment. His heart began to beat faster. The figure was an elderly woman, tied up with rough rope. Her clothes were dirty and she looked extremely weak. She had been lying there for days with no water or food. Her eyes were half closed and her lips were dry and cracked. Reyes called out gently, "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" The woman stirred slightly but did not respond clearly. He felt a surge of fear and anger at the thought that someone could leave a human being in such a condition. He looked around the area. It was quiet. No one else was nearby. Whoever had done this had abandoned her here, far from help. Reyes's mind raced. Should he untie her immediately? Should he take her to his home first? He knew the path back to the village would be long and difficult, but he could not leave her there. Carefully, Reyes knelt beside her. The rope was tight and rough, cutting into her wrists. He murmured softly to her, trying to give her comfort even though he did not know if she could hear him. "Don't worry, I will help you. You are safe now." He worked slowly, trying not to hurt her further. The woman moaned quietly as the rope loosened. Finally, she was free. She slumped into his arms, unable to stand. Reyes could feel her frailty, and it made him even more determined to protect her. He supported her as he walked back to his home. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. Reyes's house was small but tidy. He placed her gently on a cot near the window where a soft breeze could reach her. He brought her water and helped her sip it slowly. She drank eagerly but carefully, her throat dry and sore. Then he prepared a simple meal, boiled vegetables and soft bread. She ate little, but Reyes knew her body needed rest and care more than anything. As she rested, he noticed her face more clearly. Lines of hardship were etched deep into her skin. Her eyes were tired but still held a spark of life. Her hair was gray and matted in places. Reyes wondered what had happened to her. How could someone so old and weak be treated in such a cruel way? He tried not to imagine it, focusing instead on what he could do to help her now. Once she had eaten a little and sipped enough water, the woman spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for saving me." Reyes smiled gently. "Don't thank me yet, you need to rest first. We will figure out everything else later." She nodded weakly and closed her eyes. Raya sat beside her, keeping watch. The night grew dark and the crickets began their evening song. Even in the silence, he felt a strange connection forming with this woman. They were both widowed, both alone, and now somehow their lives had crossed in a way neither of them could have predicted. Over the next few hours, Raya worked quietly. He fetched warm water for her to wash, changed her soiled clothes, and made her comfortable on the cot. Every now and then, he would glance at her face, relieved to see her breathing steadily. He thought of his wife and how she would have insisted he do everything possible to help. In a way, helping this woman brought back memories of the love he had lost, but it also gave him a sense of purpose that he had been missing. The woman, whose name he learned was Shahnaz, began to speak more as she regained strength. She told him a little of what had happened. Her relatives had abandoned her after a property dispute. She had tried to seek help, but in her village, few dared to intervene against powerful families. She had been left tied up for 3 long days without water. Raya listened silently, anger and sorrow rising inside him. He could not understand how anyone could be so cruel. He promised himself that he would protect her no matter what. That night, Raya hardly slept. He kept looking at Shahnaz, ensuring she was comfortable and safe. His mind was alive with worry, but also with a sense of hope. The unexpected meeting had awakened something in him, a reminder that even in the quietest, loneliest life, there could be moments of courage and kindness. The next morning, Raya woke early as usual. Shahnaz was sitting up slightly, wrapped in a blanket. She smiled weakly at him and he smiled back. "You will be stronger soon," he said. She nodded, grateful for his care. He prepared breakfast, feeding her small portions, and then went out to the fields. Even as he worked, he thought about the challenges ahead. There would be questions from neighbors, maybe threats from those who had harmed her, and the long process of restoring her life. But he felt ready. For the first time in a long time, Raya felt that his life had a new meaning. Over the days that followed, Raya continued his routine while also tending to Shahnaz. He cleaned her wounds, helped her walk, and shared stories to lift her spirits. In return, she shared her own stories of life, loss, and the courage it takes to survive. They laughed quietly at small things, like a stray goat stealing vegetables or a bird landing on the fence, and in those moments, the heaviness of their past sorrows seemed to lighten. Raya noticed small changes in himself too. He was no longer only thinking of himself and his own loneliness. He felt responsible for another life. He felt needed again. Even though Shahnaz was frail, her presence brought warmth and companionship into his home. They began to talk about practical matters, how to secure her home, how to ensure she would not be abandoned again, and how to face the challenges from those who had harmed her. Through this experience, Raya realized that even the simplest acts of noticing, caring, and helping could make a profound difference in someone's life. A small decision, to walk along the canal path that afternoon, had changed both their lives forever. For Raya, life was no longer just about solitude and the slow passage of days. It was about courage, compassion, and the quiet heroism of standing up for someone in need. Evenings continued to be quiet, but they were no longer lonely. Raya would sit by the window and Shahnaz would be resting nearby. Sometimes they shared memories, sometimes they watched the sun set in silence. Both of them understood grief, loneliness, and survival in ways that only those who had truly lost someone could. But in that shared understanding there was also hope, hope for recovery, hope for justice, and hope for human kindness. By the end of the first part of their story, Raya and Shahnaz had formed a bond built on trust, compassion, and shared experience. Life on the farm returned to its rhythm, but it was no longer solitary. There was laughter, concern, and a sense of purpose that neither had felt for many years. Raya realized that sometimes life brings unexpected challenges, but it also brings unexpected companions. And sometimes, noticing someone in need, Even a stranger can open the door to a new chapter in life, filled with courage, hope, and quiet joy. After the first night of care and rest, Shahnaz seemed a little stronger, though she was still weak and fragile. Riaz woke early as usual, his mind restless with concern. He prepared warm water for her to wash and a small breakfast of soft bread and tea. When he brought it to her, she smiled faintly and tried to sit upright, but Riaz gently guided her back to the cot. "Take your time. Don't push yourself," he said softly. She nodded, grateful for his patience and kindness. As Shahnaz ate slowly, she began to tell him more about her life. She spoke of her late husband, a gentle man who had cared for her and her small farm. She explained that after he passed, she had tried to live quietly, tending her fields and keeping her small home in order. But her distant relatives saw an opportunity. They wanted her property, small though it was, and decided to scare her into giving it up. The plan had been cruel and simple. Leave her tied up without food or water for days until she begged to surrender everything. Riaz listened carefully, anger building quietly inside him. He could not understand how people could be so heartless. He wanted to confront them immediately, but he knew that rash actions could put both of them in danger. Instead, he focused on helping Shahnaz recover, giving her water, preparing soft meals, and tending to her wounds. Every small task seemed vital, not just for her survival, but for her sense of safety and trust. Shahnaz was hesitant at first. She had lived through fear and betrayal, and trusting someone again was difficult. But Riaz's patience and gentle care slowly broke down her walls. She began to speak more freely about the 3 long days she had spent tied up, parched and weak, calling out for help that never came. The memory brought tears to her eyes. Riaz held her hand, comforting her in silence, letting her cry without words. It was a moment of human connection, unspoken but deep, that both of them needed. As the day passed, Riaz worked in the fields, keeping an eye on Shahnaz through the window. He repaired some of the fencing near her property, knowing that the relatives who had harmed her might return if they discovered she had survived. He mended tools, cleaned water troughs for the animals, and made plans for the coming days. Despite the work, his mind was constantly with Shahnaz, wondering what the future held for her. By the second day, Shahnaz was able to sit more comfortably and even walk a short distance around the yard with Riaz supporting her. She marveled at the simple pleasures she had long forgotten, the smell of fresh earth, the soft wind on her face, and the warmth of a kind person caring for her. Riaz encouraged her gently, telling her that small steps were important. "We will take everything slowly." "You are safe here," he said. The villagers began to notice the change in Riaz's routine. Some were curious, others suspicious. A few whispered that he had brought a stranger into his home, a woman whose past they did not know, but Riaz paid little attention to gossip. He knew that protecting Shahnaz was more important than the opinions of others. He focused on her recovery, bringing her warm blankets at night, cooking nourishing meals, and making her surroundings clean and comfortable. As Shahnaz regained her strength, she revealed more about her relatives' plan. They had used deceit and manipulation, convincing others in the village that she had no one to defend her. She had tried to speak up, but fear kept the villagers silent. Her only hope had been that anyone, would notice her plight. When Riaz found her, she felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. After days of despair, someone had finally cared enough to act. Riaz felt a deep sense of responsibility. He realized that helping Shahnaz was not just an act of kindness. It was a fight for justice and human dignity. Over the next few days, he began to make small plans for how to help her regain control of her property and protect her from further harm. They spoke quietly in the evenings, discussing strategies and imagining a future where she could live safely again. Shahnaz began to feel a sense of hope that she had not known in years. She appreciated Riaz's honesty and the calm confidence with which he handled the situation. She felt safe in his presence, and slowly the fear that had haunted her began to fade. Each day, her steps became steadier, her voice stronger, and her spirit more resilient. One morning, as the sun rose over the fields, Riaz took Shahnaz outside to see the small garden she had once tended. The soil was dry and neglected, but with care, it could be restored. Together, they began to clear the weeds and plant new seeds. As they worked side by side, Shahnaz felt a sense of purpose returning to her life. The small garden became a symbol of her recovery and the care Riaz had given her. However, the outside world was not yet ready to let her live in peace. Some villagers had noticed her survival and were beginning to gossip about the incident. Riaz knew that certain relatives who had abandoned her might still cause trouble. He began to think carefully about how to handle the situation without putting them at risk. He spoke to a few trusted neighbors, quietly gathering support while keeping Shahnaz protected. Riaz also began teaching Shahnaz small practical skills she had forgotten, repairing simple tools, tending animals, and managing her property. These activities not only strengthened her body but also her confidence. She began to smile more, laugh quietly, and speak more freely about her plans for the future. The days became filled with small victories, each one reinforcing the bond between them. During this time, they shared stories of their past lives. Riaz spoke of his wife, the love they had shared, and the loneliness he had felt since her passing. Shahnaz listened, sometimes teary-eyed, sometimes smiling at his memories. She shared her own experiences of marriage, loss, and survival. They found comfort in each other's company, realizing that while their paths had been filled with sorrow, they could now face the future together. The evenings were quiet but meaningful. Riaz would sit on his wooden chair, watching the stars, while Shahnaz rested nearby. They talked about small things, the weather, the animals, the changing seasons, and sometimes they would sit in silence, simply appreciating the presence of another human being who cared. These moments, though simple, were powerful. They reminded them that even in the harshest circumstances, kindness and companionship could restore hope. One afternoon, Shahnaz expressed a desire to see her home, the place she had been abandoned. Riaz agreed but prepared carefully. They walked slowly, step by step, and when she saw her small house, she was overwhelmed with emotion. It was damaged in places, neglected, but it was hers. With Riaz's help, they began planning repairs. They discussed painting, fixing the roof, and securing the doors. For the first time in a long time, Shahnaz felt a sense of ownership and control over her life. Riaz realized that this journey was teaching him more than he had expected. He learned patience, resilience, and the importance of quiet courage. Helping Shahnaz was not easy. There were fears, uncertainties, and moments of exhaustion, but the rewards were profound. Every smile, every step she took without fear, every story she shared was a testament to the power of human kindness and determination. As the days passed, Shahnaz grew stronger and more independent. She could walk alone, tend the small garden, and manage her home with Riaz's guidance. They shared meals, worked together in the fields, and planned for the future. Even the simple act of preparing tea together became a ritual of companionship and trust. Despite the challenges, both Riaz and Shahnaz found joy in the small details of life. The sound of the wind through the trees, the first sprouts of a new crop, the laughter of a stray goat, they appreciated these moments more deeply than ever before. Their shared experiences had created a bond stronger than fear or sorrow. By the end of the second part of their story, Shahnaz had regained much of her physical strength, and her spirit was renewed. Riaz had become not just a caretaker but a friend, protector, and companion. Together, they faced the challenges ahead with courage and hope. The world outside might be harsh and unfair, but within the small farm and garden, there was safety, trust, and the quiet promise of a better future. Through these experiences, both Riaz and Shahnaz realized an important truth. that even in the darkest moments, human kindness could light a path forward. And sometimes, one person noticing another's suffering could change the course of two lives forever. Days passed, and life on the small farm began to settle into a quiet rhythm. Shahnaz was regaining her strength, and Riaz found comfort in her growing independence. They worked together in the fields, repaired her small home, and tended the garden they had started. But the calm could not last forever. Word of Shahnaz's survival began to spread through the village. Gossip traveled faster than the wind, and soon Riaz realized that some people were watching them, whispering about what had happened. At first, it was only curious neighbors. They asked questions politely, concerned about Shahnaz's health and safety. But then there were others, the distant relatives who had abandoned her. They were angry that their plan had failed. They had hoped she would give up her property in fear or despair, but she had survived, and someone had helped her. They saw Riaz as an obstacle, someone interfering with what they believed was rightfully theirs. Their glances were cold, and their words carried threats masked as polite warnings. Riaz did not take the threats lightly. He knew these relatives were powerful in the village, respected by some and feared by others. Confronting them directly could put both him and Shahnaz in danger. Instead, he began quietly preparing. He repaired the fences around her property, reinforced the doors, and kept a careful watch. He also spoke to a few trusted neighbors, explaining the situation without sharing too many details. These neighbors respected Riaz and were willing to offer small forms of support if needed. Shahnaz noticed the tension. She had already suffered once, and the thought of danger returning filled her with fear. But Riaz reassured her gently, "You are safe here. We will face this together. No one can hurt you while I am with you." His calm determination gave her courage. She realized that while the outside world could be cruel, there were people who could be trusted and who would stand for what was right. The following week brought the first signs of trouble. Late one evening, while Riaz was closing the gate to the garden, he noticed shadows moving near the edge of the property. He quickly hid, watching carefully. It was two men from Shahnaz's relatives sneaking near the house. They seemed to be looking for something, maybe checking whether she had left or whether anyone had helped her survive. Riaz's heart pounded, but he stayed calm. He decided not to confront them immediately. Instead, he observed, learning their movements and habits so that he could protect Shahnaz more effectively. Over the next few days, Riaz increased his vigilance. He stayed awake longer at night, listening for unusual sounds, and ensured that Shahnaz remained inside the house after dark. He also taught her small safety measures, how to lock doors, how to stay alert, and how to remain calm during emergencies. Every small step gave her confidence, and she gradually regained the courage that had been taken from her during those 3 terrifying days tied up without water. Meanwhile, the village authorities had begun to hear about the incident. Some villagers urged action, while others tried to downplay the situation. Riaz, knowing that justice would be slow and uncertain, decided to gather evidence. He documented the condition in which Shahnaz had been found, took note of her injuries, and kept records of the threats they received. It was not easy. The villagers were wary, and the relatives continued to spread misinformation. But Riaz knew that perseverance was the key. During this tense period, Riaz and Shahnaz grew closer. They shared stories from their pasts, each finding comfort in the other's experiences. Riaz told her about the days after his wife's death, the loneliness he had endured, and the small joys he had found in tending his farm. Shahnaz shared her memories of her husband, the life they had built together, and the fear she had felt when abandoned by her relatives. In these shared moments, their bond strengthened. They were no longer just caretaker and survivor. They were friends, allies, and companions facing life's challenges together. One afternoon, as they repaired a broken fence on the edge of the property, Riaz spoke quietly, "We must be ready for them." They will not give up easily. Shahnaz nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. She had survived once. She could survive again, especially with Riaz by her side. They worked together methodically, reinforcing weak spots, making sure there were no hidden vulnerabilities. It was hard work, but it gave them both a sense of control and preparedness. The threats did not remain idle. One night, Riaz noticed that the gate to the property had been tampered with. Someone had tried to force it open. His heart raced, but he stayed calm, checking the rest of the property carefully. He reassured Shahnaz, "They are watching, but they will not succeed. We are prepared." He spent the night near the house, keeping watch, while Shahnaz rested safely inside. As the days went on, Riaz decided it was time to involve the authorities formally. He knew that the relatives could not be allowed to intimidate Shahnaz any longer. He went to the local police station and reported the situation, providing all the evidence he had gathered. The officers were initially skeptical, but Riaz's calm and detailed account convinced them to take action. They promised to investigate and ensure Shahnaz's safety. While waiting for the authorities, Riaz continued to care for Shahnaz. He encouraged her to engage in small tasks, like tending the garden and managing her home. These activities were therapeutic, giving her purpose and restoring her confidence. They laughed quietly at minor mishaps, like a goat knocking over a basket of vegetables or a bird stealing seeds from the garden. These moments of normalcy were precious, reminding them both that life could still hold joy despite past hardships. The relatives, frustrated by the slow response of the authorities, began to escalate their intimidation. They sent messages, made threatening comments when villagers were around, and tried to create fear. Riaz remained calm, always thinking ahead. He documented everything, made sure Shahnaz stayed safe, and relied on a few trusted neighbors for support. The situation was tense, but neither Riaz nor Shahnaz allowed fear to dominate their lives. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Shahnaz asked quietly, "Do you think they will give up?" Riaz shook his head gently. "Not easily, but that is why we must stay strong and patient. Courage is not just about fighting, it is about preparing, protecting, and standing firm." She nodded, feeling reassured. The words gave her strength, and she realized that she was no longer alone. Together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Days turned into weeks, and the authorities finally began taking action. The relatives responsible for abandoning Shahnaz were questioned, and the villagers who had witnessed parts of the incident were called to testify. Riaz supported Shahnaz through each step, helping her speak calmly and confidently about what had happened. The process was slow, but each small victory was significant. They were moving toward justice, and with every step, Shahnaz regained more of her independence and self-respect. During this time, Riaz and Shahnaz continued to build their lives on the farm. They planted new crops, repaired the house, and worked side by side. The garden, once a small patch of neglected soil, began to flourish. Flowers bloomed, vegetables grew, and the property slowly returned to life. It was a sign of resilience, a symbol of how care, patience, and courage could restore what had been damaged. Despite the challenges, they found moments of happiness. In the evenings, they would sit quietly together, watching the sunset and listening to the sounds of the countryside. Sometimes they shared stories, other times they sat in silence, simply appreciating each other's presence. These small moments of peace and companionship became the heart of their days, giving them strength to face the uncertainties ahead. Riaz also began to notice a change in himself. The fear, loneliness, and grief he had carried for years began to ease. Caring for Shahnaz gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He felt needed, valued, and alive in a way he had not felt since his wife's passing. The bond they shared was quiet but deep, rooted in trust, compassion, and mutual respect. By the end of this period, Shahnaz was strong enough to move freely around her property and manage her home with confidence. The threats from her relatives, while still present, had lost much of their power due to the support from Raya's, the villagers, and the authorities. The experience had strengthened both of them, teaching patience, resilience, and the importance of standing together in the face of adversity. Through these trials, Rayas and Shahnaz discovered an important truth: that courage is not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and persistent. It is found in patience, preparation, and the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And sometimes, one person's compassion can change the life of another forever. The bond between Rayas and Shahnaz had grown stronger than fear, threats, or past sorrows. They had faced danger together, navigated challenges with care and wisdom, and built a life filled with trust, companionship, and quiet joy. The farm was no longer just a place of work. It had become a sanctuary, a space where two people who had known loss could find strength and hope in each other. The days after the threats and tension began to ease were some of the most important in Shahnaz and Rayas's lives. The authorities had finally started taking the matter seriously. Officials came to the village to question the relatives who had abandoned Shahnaz. They spoke to neighbors and reviewed the evidence Rayas had collected. Slowly, justice began to move forward. For the first time in months, Shahnaz felt a sense of relief. She no longer had to fear that her life would be disrupted or that her home would be taken from her. Rayas continued to support her, as he had from the very beginning. He made sure she was present during the official questioning, helping her feel confident and protected. She gave her account carefully, describing the 3 terrible days she had spent tied up and without water. The officials listened, taking notes and asking questions. Rayas could see the determination in their eyes, and it filled him with hope. He also noticed the courage growing in Shahnaz. She no longer trembled when talking about her relatives. Her voice, though soft, was firm, and her eyes held a quiet strength. While the authorities worked, Rayas and Shahnaz focused on rebuilding her life. They repaired the house together, fixing broken doors and windows, painting walls, and cleaning every corner until it shone. The garden, which had already begun to flourish, became a source of pride and joy. They planted vegetables and flowers, tended the soil carefully, and watered each seed with care. It was hard work, but every sprout that grew reminded them that life could flourish even after the darkest times. Neighbors began to notice the change. Some came to help with small tasks, offering tools, seeds, or advice. Others admired the way Rayas and Shahnaz supported each other, and the way they restored the home and garden. Slowly, the whispers of gossip shifted from fear and suspicion to respect and admiration. People began to understand that standing up for what is right, even quietly, could make a big difference. The relatives who had caused Shahnaz so much pain were called to appear in front of the authorities. They were ordered to explain their actions and the reasons for abandoning her. Some tried to lie, claiming she had left voluntarily, but the evidence Rayas had gathered and the testimony of witnesses made it clear that the claims were false. The officials acted with patience and fairness, ensuring that justice was served. The relatives were warned, and the legal process began to restore Shahnaz's rights. During this period, Rayas and Shahnaz shared small but meaningful moments of peace. Early mornings were spent in the garden, watering the plants and listening to birds sing. Afternoons were for repairing tools or preparing simple meals together. Evenings became a time of reflection. They would sit outside, watching the sun sink behind the hills, feeling the cool breeze on their faces. In those quiet moments, they appreciated the safety, trust, and companionship they had built together. Shahnaz also regained confidence in managing her property. She could walk freely around her home, tend the animals, and organize her small fields. Rayas remained nearby, offering advice or support when needed, but he encouraged her independence. Each day, she became stronger, more self-reliant, and more determined to live her life fully. The trauma she had endured slowly transformed into a determination to rebuild, and Riaz's presence gave her the courage to take the first steps toward normalcy. One day, as they were repairing a section of fencing, Shahnaz paused and looked at Riaz. "You have done so much for me," she said quietly. "I do not know how I can ever repay you." Riaz smiled gently. "You do not need to repay me. Helping you was the right thing to do. Seeing you safe and strong is enough." They both understood that the bond they shared was not built on obligation, but on trust, care, and shared experiences. The legal process continued steadily. The authorities ensured that Shahnaz's property rights were fully restored. Her relatives could no longer interfere, and any threats they made were documented and addressed. For Shahnaz, this was not just about property, it was about reclaiming her life, dignity, and independence. She now had control over her home and farm, and with Riaz's continued support, she could live without fear. As life settled, Riaz and Shahnaz's relationship deepened. They were no longer only caretaker and survivor, they had become companions, friends, and allies. They shared meals, worked together in the fields, and spent quiet evenings talking about their lives, dreams, and hopes. Their conversations often drifted to memories of their lost spouses, and in those moments, they found comfort and understanding. Each had experienced grief, loneliness, and hardship, but together they discovered hope and resilience. The farm became a symbol of their journey. The small house, once neglected and damaged, now stood strong and welcoming. The garden, full of vibrant flowers and fresh vegetables, represented growth, renewal, and the fruits of their hard work. Even the animals on the property seemed to thrive, sensing the calm and care that surrounded them. Every day brought a small but significant achievement, reminding them that life could be rebuilt, even after suffering. Riaz also noticed changes within himself. The weight of loneliness and grief he had carried for years began to ease. Caring for Shahnaz had given him a sense of purpose and fulfillment that he had not felt since his wife passed. He felt alive, needed, and appreciated in a way that reminded him of the joys of human connection. He began to feel hope for the future, a belief that even in later years, life could bring companionship, joy, and meaning. Shahnaz, too, experienced transformation. She learned to trust again, to take control of her life, and to find strength within herself. The fear and helplessness that had dominated her thoughts during the 3 days she was abandoned gradually disappeared. She began to enjoy simple pleasures again, the warmth of the sun, the smell of fresh earth, and the satisfaction of nurturing plants that grew under her care. The quiet life of the farm became a source of healing and happiness. One afternoon, as they prepared a small meal together, Shahnaz looked around the garden and house. "It feels like life is returning," she said softly. Riaz nodded. "Yes, it is. Slowly, carefully, and with patience, we have restored what was broken." They shared a quiet smile, understanding that the journey had been difficult but worthwhile. Every step, from the first moment Riaz had found her tied up to now, had been a step toward justice, safety, and renewal. The village began to recognize the change as well. People spoke of Riaz's courage, Shahnaz's resilience, and the quiet strength they both demonstrated. Neighbors admired how they worked together, cared for each other, and rebuilt a life despite past hardships. The story of their perseverance became an example of hope and human kindness, showing that even in difficult circumstances, courage and compassion could prevail. As time passed, the authorities formally restored Shahnaz's property rights. She could now live without fear of harassment or loss. The relatives who had abandoned her were no longer a threat, and the legal system ensured that justice had been served. This victory, though small in the grand scheme, was monumental for Shahnaz. It meant safety, dignity, and the ability to live life on her terms. Riaz celebrated with her quietly, sharing the joy of justice and peace. Their lives settled into a new rhythm, filled with routine, companionship, and the satisfaction of overcoming hardship. Reyes continued his work on the farm, but it was no longer a solitary endeavor. Shaughna's presence added warmth, conversation, and shared responsibility. Together, they planted new seeds, both in the garden and in their lives. Each day was a reminder that even after suffering, life could be rebuilt with care, patience, and support. Evenings remained their favorite time. They would sit outside, watching the sun set behind the hills, sharing thoughts, stories, and quiet laughter. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, appreciating the calm and safety around them. These moments of connection and reflection reminded them both that human kindness, trust, and courage could bring light even after the darkest experiences. Reyes and Shaughna's story became one of hope, resilience, and quiet heroism. From the moment Reyes noticed her tied up and suffering, to their shared efforts to rebuild her life and secure justice, their journey was marked by courage, patience, and compassion. They learned that even in the face of cruelty and danger, standing together and helping one another could restore faith in life and humanity. By the end of this chapter of their lives, both Reyes and Shaughna's had changed profoundly. Reyes found renewed purpose and companionship, while Shaughna's regained her independence, dignity, and confidence. Together, they had turned a story of suffering into one of courage, recovery, and hope. The farm, the garden, and the home they restored became symbols of human resilience, the power of kindness, and the possibility of new beginnings, no matter the past. Their story reminded everyone that courage is not always loud. It can be quiet, persistent, and steadfast. Human kindness, even in the smallest acts, can change the course of lives forever. And sometimes, a single moment of noticing someone in need can create ripples of hope, healing, and transformation that last a lifetime.